This video is about cells. Remember that cells are the basic unit of structure and function. That is, living things have to be at least a cell to be alive, and that humans are multicellular. They're made of many different cells and over 6 trillion of them. When you think about the major components of a cell, we have the outer covering, that's A, it's called the plasma membrane. And then we have the control center, B, that's the nucleus. And then we have this area of the cell called the cytosol, or sometimes cytoplasm, where the cytoplasm consists of cytosol and then organelles, which would be D. So together, C and D are going to make up the cytoplasm. And those are like the main parts of the cell. What we're going to do is kind of work through some of these major components. So we'll look at the plasma membrane first, and then we'll look at some of the organelles and what their functions are. So here's a diagram of a plasma membrane. The first thing you want to notice is that it's a phospholipid bilayer. So that means there's 2 layers of these molecules called phospholipids. Remember that phospholipids are one of the types of lipids. There's a phosphate group, that's this kind of light yellow ball at the top. And then there's these fatty acid chains. So those fatty acid chains could be saturated or unsaturated. But here in the cell membrane, it's significant that the phosphate group is facing outward and the 2 layers of fatty acid chains are facing inward. What that means is that the plasma membrane arranges itself in a way that those 2 fatty acid chains face each other. And the reason they face each other is because they're hydrophobic. That means that they repel water. Whereas the 2 phosphates on the outside, they are hydrophilic. That means water-loving. Hydro, water, philic, like phileo, loving. So they face the watery outside extracellular environment and the watery inside, the intracellular environment. Well, because of this, we have a lipid bilayer. So that means 2 layers of lipids. So think of it kind of like a double stuffed Oreo cookie. You have 2 layers of lipids, and then you have this layer of phosphate on either side. Embedded in that phospholipid bilayer are some proteins. Now, some of these proteins you can see here are like transmembrane proteins. That means they go all the way through the membrane. Then you have these other proteins that are channel proteins. That means they create a gate or window or door in this phospholipid bilayer. The reason that's significant is because things like water can't easily get through that membrane because oil and water repel. So water has a hard time making it through the cell membrane, so a gate or channel can be really helpful. Other molecules might be too large to simply move through the membrane, so they need a special gate or channel to get through. So those are called channel proteins. You'll notice then that some of these proteins have carbohydrate chains. That's going to help make them receptor proteins. In other words, that's how one cell identifies what another cell is. Then again, you have these like integral proteins that could be glycoprotein. So glyco means there's a carbohydrate chain attached to a protein as opposed to a glycolipid where the carbohydrate chain is attached to a lipid. Together, some of these glycoproteins make what's called the glycocalyx, which is this kind of fuzzy layer on the outside of a cell. And it helps the cells kind of bind together, and it creates these like receptor proteins or cell recognition proteins, things like that. You'll also notice some peripheral proteins. So sometimes peripheral proteins will act like digestive enzymes. So along the digestive tract, these cells will have peripheral proteins that their job is to break down carbohydrates, fats, lipids. Selective permeability means that some things are able to move through the plasma membrane, but some things are not. Some things can pass through easily, and some things can't. That process is called diffusion, where you're just moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration across the membrane. In the case of the cell, that's the plasma membrane. In the case of the cell, moving across that membrane goes from high concentration to low concentration. So in this example, you can see that side A has a high concentration of the orange shapes. Side B has a high concentration of the blue shapes. Diffusion just means the random movement of molecules from an area where there's a lot to an area where there is a little. And that movement is going to continue across that membrane until it's about even. And that's called dynamic equilibrium, when the two sides are about even. But a movement like that always goes from an area of high concentration to low concentration. No energy is required. It's just a random movement of molecules. Just like a person going down a sliding board from an area where it's higher to an area where it's lower. Now, there are some factors that will influence diffusion. For example, increased temperature will increase the rate of diffusion. And increased concentration, it's kind of like making this ladder taller, will increase that movement. And then the molecule size. Smaller molecules are easier to diffuse than larger molecules. When a cell is placed into a solution where the concentration on the outside of the cell is greater than the solute concentration on the inside of the cell, that is called a hypertonic solution. Hypertonic means that the tonicity of the solution is greater than the cell. In other words, that the amount of water in the cell, the concentration of water in the cell is less than the concentration of water around it. So hypertonic would be like letter C here, and the result would be the water is moving from an area of low concentration in the cell to an area of high concentration outside of the cell. If there's a high concentration of water outside of the cell, that's a hypotonic solution, which means that the solute concentration is very low outside of the cell, and the solute concentration inside of the cell is very high. As a result, there's so much solute, there's not enough water, solvent. So the water is moving into the cell, causing it to swell. That's a hypotonic solution. If the amount of water is even on the outside of the cell as it is on the inside of the cell, then that's an isotonic solution. Isotonic solution. Active transport requires energy because it's moving substances from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. It's like going up the sliding board this time. You can see here a channel protein is going to be involved in acting as a pump. That pump requires energy. So in nerve cells, for example, the sodium is being pumped out, whereas the potassium is being pumped in against the concentration gradient. In other words, it's going from an area where it's low to an area where it's high, kind of like going up the sliding board. Another example of this would be something like endocytosis, where the cell membrane surrounds a external molecule or cell and engulfs it. Endocytosis, like going into the cell. Another example might be exocytosis, where a molecule in the cell is like the membrane moves out around it so that that molecule is excreted, it exits the cell. So exocytosis. So those are some examples of transport. That concludes this segment about the plasma membrane.